Thank you, Benjamin. So first caveat is I will not be dancing. You do not want to see that. And no tattoos. So unfortunately. All right, well, so Drew told me to put the cover of my book on my slide, so there it is. I didn't want to argue with Drew, so there we are. All right. Well, it's great to be with you all today. It's been a wonderful conference, and I want to just thank the center for the invitation to be part of this conference, and particularly thank Megan, who maybe slipped out. Megan, thank you so much just for your hospitality. It's been wonderful. And these questions that we're considering about human formation and spiritual formation, I think, are critical for the church in our times. And we've already had some wonderful conversation, very rich, a lot for me to reflect on. And so I look forward to just the continued dialogue. So, see if this will work. There we go. Okay. So I want to start off with sharing a little bit of my story that illustrates, I think, the struggles that many people are experiencing today. And my story is ultimately what led me to write Relational Spirituality. So as far back as I can remember, my mom struggled with very significant mental health issues. And my parents split up when I was pretty young, about 9 years old. And all of this contributed to a sense of disconnection from my family, from friends, and even within myself. I developed ways to protect myself from this pain, but they always backfired in the end and led to more of a sense of emptiness and less authentic relationships. And this feeling of being alone and disconnected seeped into my relationship with God. Up through my college years in particular, I often felt very distant from God. It still happens from time to time today, but was more common back then. And I realized later that the pain and disconnection in my relationship with God was linked to these formative childhood experiences. And I think my story is a reflection of our collective story of relational and spiritual disconnection and the search for meaning in a fragmented, lonely, post-COVID world. I'm not sure if you're allowed to say post-COVID, but you know what I mean. Many people are feeling this uneasy disconnection today because the family unit and communities that teach us how to connect to other people and to God have been steadily weakening over the past 50 to 60 years. We are living in the midst of a connection crisis. So how then do you and I cultivate connection and spiritual formation in the midst of increasing social isolation, loneliness, and fragmentation? The short answer is we are loved into loving. In recent decades, a new relational spirituality paradigm has emerged from many different fields, including Trinitarian theology, which we've heard some about today, and within the social sciences, a number of different fields such as attachment theory, relational psychoanalysis, infant research, emotion research, interpersonal neurobiology, and affective neuroscience, just to name a few. There is now a critical mass of evidence that human beings are fundamentally relational. We grow, heal, and find meaning through relationships with God and others, ultimately in the context of the church, the new family of God. This is the central idea of a relational spirituality paradigm. And so this morning I want to focus on a few key themes around that central idea. And in particular, I want to focus in on the idea of implicit relational knowledge and how that plays out in our attachment to God, drawing on attachment theory, and also the process of deep growth or deep transformation. So here is an overview of the themes I want to talk about. After briefly touching on the connection crisis that I mentioned, I want to just set the frame for a relational spirituality paradigm for spiritual formation, and then talk about attachment filters, drawing from attachment theory, as I mentioned, and then the process of deep growth. So let's dive into this challenge we are facing, the connection crisis. It's no secret that there's an enormous amount of stress going on in the world today that is negatively impacting Christians and non-Christians alike all over the world. There's been a pandemic, there's a war going on, there's been a lot of social unrest and unprecedented change and uncertainty in our organizations. This has amplified an already existing trend of rising mental health issues. Research is showing an overall decline in mental health since the pandemic in the US, and the statistics are probably similar worldwide. And just from my own anecdotal evidence, working as a psychologist at the Biola Counseling Center at Biola, I have seen a drastic increase in the severity of the issues that students are coming in with. 25 years ago when I started, after getting out of the Army, when I was in the Army as a psychologist, I saw everything under the sun. When I went to Biola, the issues coming in from the students were relatively mild. Now there's no difference between what I saw in the Army and what I see today. And we were talking about this at dinner the other night. Our counseling center has a waiting list within 4 to 6 weeks every semester. Usually within the first 2 weeks, there are several suicide attempts among our students. Sexual trauma, all kinds of trauma is not the exception anymore. We see this all the time, and this is happening in counseling centers across the country. They are overwhelmed. They can't keep up with the demand and the need. When I was a graduate student at Biola seeing clients, there were no limits on the number of sessions we could see students for. Now we have a limit of 10 sessions. And so many students need more than 10 sessions. It's just scratching the surface. Based on the results of their 2020 Stress in America report, the American Psychological Association stated, "We are facing a national mental health crisis that could yield serious health and social consequences for years to come." While external stressors are going on in the world are certainly contributing to the rising mental health issues, I would suggest that the root cause is social disconnection. Many of the general mental health issues we're seeing today are signs and symptoms of social disconnection. Psychologist Diana Fosha contends that mental health problems ultimately stem from feeling alone in the midst of unbearable emotional pain. Again, it's that connection piece. There's a large research base now documenting the rise in social disconnection over the last 50 to 60 years, which shows up in a number of different ways, including a decline in social capital, defined by Robert Putnam in his book, Bowling Alone, if you're familiar with his work, as social networks comprised of reciprocity and trustworthiness. We also see a decline in closeness that people experience with friends, family, and community. Also a decline in the number of confidants that people have. So people that you can talk to about important issues in your life. The most common number of confidants has decreased from 3 in the mid-1980s to 0 in 2004. So think about that. The average person out there in your pews and your networks has no one with whom to talk about important issues in their life. That is a disturbing trend. We also see this trend in the increase in loneliness. I'm sure you've heard about this and see it in your networks. Loneliness has doubled in the United States since the 1980s. Recently, in 2017, Vivek Murthy, the former US Surgeon General, stated that loneliness is a growing health epidemic. Some of you may be familiar as well in the UK. Very similar problem, and a couple of years ago, they instituted a minister of loneliness. It's so bad in the UK. So what does all this have to do with our spiritual lives? It turns out there's a strong link between social and spiritual disconnection. Social disconnection has a profound impact on our experience of God and spiritual community. The connection crisis in our society has led to a parallel spiritual connection crisis. So why does this happen? When I was young, I quickly developed strategies to avoid my emotional pain and secure some kind of pseudo-connection with authority figures, with important people in my life. And we all do this. We develop strategies, albeit mostly subconsciously, to cope with the emotional pain of disconnection and to maintain some kind of connection to the important people in our lives. And we do this because God created us to connect. We need relationship, especially as children. And this was discovered in part by psychoanalysts in the 1940s who were seeing children in therapy who had been abused. And they found time and time again that these children still wanted to maintain a connection with their parents. And we see this today, right? Why? Why would you want a connection with a parent who is abusing you? Because some relationship, even if it's abusive or malformed, is better than no relationship at all. And so as children, we take on the bad and we accommodate the parents and we develop these strategies. And I'll talk more about how that plays out in a few minutes. So, for example, we might become overly self-reliant so as to not bother others. We might become a people pleaser, an entertainer, or an achiever to try to earn people's love. These strategies, or defense mechanisms, as psychologists call them, inevitably backfire. They are necessary at the time. They help us cope, but they have a cost. They backfire. And they hinder the very connection we most want and need. This happens because these strategies require us to sacrifice something that is necessary for healthy relationships, and that's connection with ourselves. John Calvin emphasized the idea of double knowledge, that sanctification requires knowledge of the self and knowledge of God. So these defense mechanisms negatively impact our knowledge of the self, ourselves, and therefore negatively impact spiritual growth. As believers, we often play out these strategies in the context of our spiritual life. They have the same defensive function and the same negative effects, causing us to feel spiritually empty and disconnected from God. So there's evidence that social and spiritual disconnection are on the rise. How do our models of spiritual growth factor into this? Another layer of this challenge is that within many sectors of the evangelical movement, there is a growing recognition that our conceptual models of spiritual transformation are truncated. And so they're not addressing these critical issues. A recent study on the current state of discipleship, for example, noted that in many churches, there is an assumption that the appropriation of biblical knowledge will by itself lead to spiritual maturity. This assumption gets to the heart of the problem that relational spirituality addresses, a rationalistic paradigm of knowing God, ourselves, and others. And this is part of my story. After my parents split up, my mom left the family, and I became a Christian shortly after that. But there was a lot of pain beneath the surface that I had to cope with. There were times I focused a lot of my energy on gaining knowledge about God and about the Bible. And those are good things in and of themselves, but I believed somewhere deep down that if I just knew enough about God, if I just knew enough about Scripture, then I would grow, and more importantly, all this pain for my family would go away. And this worked for a while, but over time, the knowledge I had about God felt empty because it was only in my head, and I didn't feel God's presence. Focusing on ideas about God kept my pain away in the short run, but at the cost of connection, relationship with God. This rationalistic approach to Scripture and God has long-standing historical roots, and it's caused some segments of the evangelical movement to emphasize knowing about God, which is good, but at the expense of knowing God relationally. Part of the reason for this is that focusing on relationship with God and others is a messy process. It's one that we can't control, and it requires dependence on God and surrender to God. In this vein, in his wonderful book, Life in the Trinity, Donald Fairbairn states, part of the reason there's a divorce between doctrine and Christian life is that contemporary evangelicals normally understand doctrines as concepts, teachings, true ideas to which we often give the word propositions, and we unwittingly see these doctrines as the objects of our faith. I mentioned that early in my Christian life, the knowledge I had about God felt empty because I didn't feel God's presence. Toward the end of college, for the first time, but by no means the last, I came to the end of myself. My relationships were falling apart. I couldn't seem to make it better. And I came to the end of myself. And I realized that I needed help to grow and heal. And so I turned to God. And God showed up. In a powerful moment, He was very present and affirmed that I needed help. And He brought some wonderful people into my life at that point in my life. And that experience put me on a different path, a path of embracing a relational paradigm of spiritual growth in which your spirituality empowers you to face your pain with the help of loving relationships, and from that to grow in your love for God and neighbor. A relational paradigm is based on a theology of being in relation, a relational view of the image of God. Our Trinitarian God is intrinsically relational. Three persons of the Godhead living in perfect union, mutuality, and harmony with each other. A unity or interpenetration captured by the ancient Greek term perichoresis. So the proposal here is that the primary way in which we reflect God or are like God is in our relational nature, that we are beings in relation. And this model has three basic organizing principles. First, that we as human beings have a relational nature. We do have a nature. It is a relational nature. I think we see this in Scripture, and it is corroborated in a lot of psychology research that I'll touch on today briefly. The second is that the goal of sanctification is a relational goal that I refer to as loving presence, and I think we've heard about that in numerous talks while we've been here, which is the result of being renewed in the image of Christ. And third, the process of sanctification. How do we get there? The way we get there, the process of sanctification, is relational. It's a relational process. We heal and grow primarily and directly through relationships with God and others, ultimately, again, in the context of the church, the new family of God. We are loved into loving. In short, a relational spirituality paradigm suggests that spiritual transformation is a relational process in which you become more loving by taking in more and more of Christ's love for you. When I was younger, it was difficult and scary for me to open up to others. The reason is that I had a filter operating for close relationships that said something like this: if I open up to others, they will let me down and hurt me. That is what I expected to happen at a very deep gut level. It caused me to become very self-sufficient until the walls I built came crashing down. So what are these filters, and how do they change? This is the second theme I want to touch on of this relational spirituality model: attachment filters, how relationships shape our capacity to love. So this is Alan Shore. There is now strong scientific evidence that human beings are born to form attachment relationships, or that we are created to connect. And this is how Alan Shore, a neuropsychologist who is a leading thinker in this area, puts it. He says, the idea is that we are born to form attachments, that our brains are physically wired to develop in tandem with another's through emotional communication before words are spoken. I thought about that several times as we've been talking about our embodied nature, right? Relational embodied nature. Our brains are literally wired through relationships, especially with attachment figures early on. The mother's right brain in particular helps the infant's right brain to regulate their emotions, and then those processes get internalized in this implicit gut level form of memory. So what is an attachment relationship? An attachment relationship is a particular kind of relationship, a deep connection between a caregiver, usually someone stronger and wiser, but we do have these at peer level as well, and someone on the receiving end of that care, such as a child. So the parent-child relationship is the prototype. Also a relationship with God, which I'll talk about. When a child becomes attached to her parent, which usually happens by 6 months of age, this is in place. It's implicit gut level form of memory. These patterns are in place by 6 months of age. Something happens inside each one of them and between the two of them. An invisible bond develops that is supported by a literal brain-to-brain link-up between parent and child. The way this invisible bond shows itself is through three characteristics. First, infants seek to stay physically close to their attachment figures. And the flip side of that coin, they become distressed when separated. And that's normal, even when there's a healthy, secure attachment. Children become distressed when they're separated, but if there's a healthy, secure attachment, they learn quickly to cope with that because they're comforted by their parents and they internalize that ability. And so by 12 months of age, we can see that. So as we grow, emotional connection relies less on physical proximity and more on the memory of the felt presence of the attachment figure. Second, attachment figures provide to varying degrees what we can call a secure base. So there's two aspects to this: comfort when we're distressed, and then challenge or encouragement to explore the world. Attachment theory refers to these as a haven of safety and a secure base, but they're really two sides of the same coin, so we can just think of these as a secure base. Overall, when when attachment figures are available when needed, when they're responsive, when they're emotionally attuned, and not perfectly, by the way. There's research that clearly demonstrates you don't have to be perfectly attuned. Secure mothers are attuned, maybe 2/3 of the time at best. But when they are attuned, comforting when distressed, and when they encourage exploration, then attachment figures provide their children a sense of security about themselves and their worlds, and the children internalize this in this implicit form of memory. Our sense of felt security comes primarily from the specific people to whom we are attached. So the take-home point about secure attachment is this: a secure base comprised of a combination of comfort and challenge or encouragement is what creates a felt sense of security, or an internal secure base for children and for adults. As I mentioned, this gets internalized and forms an internal template for how relationships work for us based on our past experiences, which then shapes how we experience relationships, how we relate to others at a subconscious level. It's outside of conscious awareness. Okay, so we've talked about attachment in infancy with infants, and that's where a lot of the research started, but it's been extended to look at attachment in adulthood. So what about in adulthood? The attachment system operates throughout life, and so adults also form attachment relationships with others. However, the overall way that emotional connection is sought, experienced, and communicated transitions from physical closeness in infancy to emotional intimacy, or felt security, as Dan Siegel calls it, in adulthood. There is now a very, very large body of literature on attachment that clearly establishes that attachment affects nearly every aspect of development throughout the lifespan. For example, research shows a strong association between insecure attachment in infancy and behavior problems in preschool, neuroticism or general negative affect, and a whole spectrum of specific mental disorders. And this is not all cross-sectional research. There are quite a few longitudinal studies now that have tracked people from infancy into their early 30s, looking at attachment across all these different points. So we know there is a causal effect here. In addition to the prototype of becoming attached to parents, we can also become attached to spouses, partners, close friends, and to God. And there's a large research literature on attachment to God, and I'll return to that in a moment. But first I want to mention we can also become personally and or symbolically attached to leaders and organizations, for example, pastors. So those of you who are pastoring or going into that or any kind of ministry or leadership position, you will have the privilege of your entire congregation projecting their attachment issues onto you. So they didn't tell you that, right? Is this true, Alan? So that's one of the things you get to deal with. And I think that's one of the important things of understanding, back to the conversation actually with Aaron earlier, right? What are some of the things that can be helpful in a church community? Understanding trauma, understanding how people process and relate to and experience leaders in the community, right, based on their attachment experiences. So let's take a look again at attachment to God for a minute. So Jake is a client, not his real name, but came to see me for therapy due to anxiety about his unstable relationship with his girlfriend. When he was young, Jake lost his mother, and his father showed very little empathy and really wasn't able to help him process his loss at all, just didn't talk about it, shut it down. And so this led to an attachment tendency or filter that could be captured in a statement I made to Jake once trying to capture his experience, in which I said, Jake, it sounds like you feel like eventually everyone will leave you. And that really captured his experience. Jake also experienced a lot of anxiety in his relationship with God. He expected God to be inconsistently available. And I'm talking here again at this implicit gut level. Much like his father was inconsistently available. He would often anxiously pray during a crisis, and as if he had to be in a desperate situation to get God's attention, much like with his father. Even if he experienced some temporary relief, he would often then withdraw from God and church to protect himself from the pain of impending abandonment. Because again, at a deep gut level, he expected abandonment. At some point, everyone in my life is going to leave because based on his experience, that's just how it works. So his ingrained patterns of relating and feeling shaped all of his relationships, including his relationship with God. So this raises a question. Does our attachment to God mirror our human attachment patterns? Or can we experience God as loving and secure despite painful and even traumatic experiences with human attachment figures? I think the answer to both questions is a qualified yes. Our attachment to God at a gut implicit level does tend to mirror our attachment patterns with human beings, with the people that we have become attached to as in our parents, even when it's painful and insecure and unhealthy. The reason is that attachment to God is based on a deep implicit relational form of knowing that is crafted from our experiences with human beings on whom we've depended for life, physical protection, and emotional security. Jake's attachment to God was shaped in profound ways by his early upbringing. And part of the reason I got into this was seeing this with all of my clients. And there was a research literature developing around attachment to God and some psychologists looking at this question of what's the relationship between attachment to God and human attachment? Are there parallels? And so it's in the literature, it's called compensation or correspondence. Does it correspond? Is there a parallel? Or is there compensation that God can compensate for insecure attachment? And I think, like I said, both are true, but I think we have to separate out explicit levels of knowledge and implicit knowledge. And what I was seeing with my clients over and over again to a person is that when people came in and had insecure attachment or trauma, these experiences played out in their relationship with God because it's this deep gut level form of knowledge. Thankfully, our attachment to God can grow, heal, and change with new loving relational experiences with others and directly with God. So what do these attachment relationships look like? It turns out there are 4 broad patterns of attachment that we've learned from research. And of course, this is an oversimplification from research. When you get to an individual, of course, there's going to be much more complexity and nuance, but this gives us some kind of handle on the broad patterns. So there's 4 basic patterns that you can see here on the slide, identified in research based on 2 underlying factors, which you can see on these 2 dimensions. So on the vertical dimension, you've got relational engagement versus avoidance. On the horizontal dimension, emotional distress versus emotional composure. And so when you cross those, you get these 4 quadrants and 4 types of attachments. And this research is based on underlying latent factors identified in infant behavior in an experimental paradigm called the strange situation, also in adults' answers in a semi-structured interview called the adult attachment interview, and self-report measures of attachment. All 3 different methodologies reveal these same 2 underlying latent factors, which is quite interesting. So as I mentioned, we find that these attachment patterns develop early on, definitely by 12 months of age, but they continue into adulthood. What happens is that repeated experiences with caregivers get stored in an implicit gut level form of memory and create an implicit template or mental model for how relationships work, again, for us, based on our experience. And these templates operate outside of conscious awareness, and they shape how we relate to others. Your subconscious mind, or implicit self, comes to believe what it perceives about how important people in your life feel about you. In about 70% of cases, these attachment patterns remain unchanged. So there's research that has shown this over 10 to 13 years, tracking these people. But they can change with reflection, new relational experiences, new habits. There's a lot of different inputs that can go into changing these. And each of these insecure types of attachment reflect different ways of protecting ourselves. So they're referred to in attachment theory as strategies to protect ourselves from these insecure, painful, unhealthy relationships. So again, that we can maintain some kind of pseudo-connection with the important people in our lives. But these self-protective strategies always have a cost. So whatever your ingrained patterns of connecting are with others, you will recreate that relational environment with the most important people in your life. So all of us need to be aware of our attachment patterns and be on a journey of growing in our capacities to develop secure-based connection, especially in any kind of spiritual leadership. And we don't always operate just in one quadrant, but we do tend to have one dominant attachment pattern, which tends to be the pattern we developed with the parent or attachment figure to whom we were the closest, even if that was insecure. But it can change. We can have different attachment patterns or styles that come up with different types of relationships. And sometimes I find that when one of these strategies starts to break down, so say someone with this dismissing attachment, which I'll talk about in a minute, undergoes a crisis, and this way of coping starts to break down and is not working anymore, they flip into anxious attachment. They're not going to go here to secure until some work has been done internally. So if we take a look at these, if you look in the upper, we'll start in the upper left quadrant with anxious attachment, sometimes called preoccupied attachment. So Jake is an example of this. I mentioned my client, Jake, who had this filter that could be captured by this comment that I made to him, that eventually everyone will leave at some point. So this is a version of anxious or preoccupied attachment. And so this is how some people cope with caregivers who are inconsistently available. And so what they do is they hyperactivate their attachment system. They kick it into overdrive because sometimes it works, right? Occasionally their parents showed up and were actually there for them. And so if they can just hyperactivate their attachment system, they just might get some connection. And so they tend to cling on to other people, and they expect rejection and abandonment. So you can see some of the characteristics on the slide there. Dysregulated vulnerability. So they can be vulnerable, but it's in a dysregulated way. They're not able to manage their emotions very well. They tend to be emotionally clingy, emotionally dysregulated again, overly reliant on others, especially, by the way, when we are in a crisis or become distressed or feel threatened, is when our attachment system in particular kicks into high gear. And so people who kind of operate in this spectrum will be overly reliant on others to help them through a crisis and to manage their emotions and their pain. And so you may see this, you will see this in a church context, and it's helpful to understand, why is this happening? Why is this person relating to me in this way? There are always good emotional reasons for why people do what they do and why they relate. And so it's helpful if you can understand that and help them understand that. They tend to lack confidence. They look to the other, again, to help them manage. And they have an embedded stance toward their experience. In other words, they feel sort of trapped in their experience. They're not able to develop what psychologists call an observing ego and step outside of their experience and reflect on it and look at it and take perspective. Other people's perspectives, and have different perspectives on their own experience. They get sort of trapped. So if we look down to the bottom right, and by the way, so this is a combination, right, of emotional distress and engagement. So when they feel distress and they express it when they become, when they get into a crisis or feel threatened, but they do engage with people, but it's out of this dysregulated vulnerability. Dismissing attachment is a little bit of the opposite, right? So if you look at this quadrant, we've got relational avoidance and emotional composure kind of on the surface. So when they get distressed or feel threatened, they withdraw from people. They're not comfortable with emotional intimacy because their attachment figures tended to have been neglectful and consistently not available. So they learned, I have to deal with stuff myself. I had a client one time who said, he said, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that John is the only person who's going to take care of John. He learned that early on. So there's low vulnerability. They're not aware of their emotions as much. And again, they tend to isolate. They become emotionally guarded, emotionally disengaged, overly self-reliant. So when they are distressed or threatened, they're going to withdraw when they most need people and God. They're going to withdraw because that's what they learned. That's how they learned to cope early on. There's a pseudo-confidence. So they're going to be composed on the surface, but underneath there's a lot of pain that they're churning through to try to protect against. And there's a disconnected stance toward their experience. If we look at the bottom left there, fearful attachment. So that's avoidance and distress, right? So there's distress, and they want, at some level, they want someone to help them manage that distress, but connection has been associated with pain and oftentimes abuse and trauma. And so you get this inconsistency back and forth. So a client who I'll call Jane exhibited this style. She was relationally avoidant and had a history of severe trauma. She would often dissociate. She was fearful of me at times, and she would often emotionally withdraw, sabotage herself, and sabotage our work together. And she was emotionally unpredictable. I mean, sometimes I felt I saw her for almost 12 years, 4 hours a week. And from one day to the next, sometimes I felt like I was seeing a different person. She would be completely dysregulated, dissociated on a Monday, and then come in Wednesday and be in a completely different state of mind. And it was like a different person. She would self-sabotage, dissociate, emotionally unpredictable. So there often is a history of abuse here, not always, but. So top right, secure, that's what we're going for, right? Secure attachment. So people who had parents, authority figures, but develop this, but it doesn't have to happen only then. There's also, in attachment theory, it's called earned security, which is kind of an unfortunate term. It should probably be transformed security. But through new relationships, you can develop security later in life. And so then there's not a need to hyperactivate or deactivate your attachment system. So people who are operating in the secure attachment realm are comfortable with emotional intimacy and close relationships. They're comfortable reaching out to others when they need help. But there's also a balance, right? They're able to be emotionally close. They're regulated, but they're able to be vulnerable, right? So they're vulnerable, but they don't overwhelm people with their emotional pain. There's a balanced reliance on self and others, right? So they can manage their emotions, but they also recognize they need people, and they can reach out when they need to. And there's a genuine confidence. It doesn't mean arrogance, but just a genuine confidence in themselves and their ability to cope and manage. And a reflective stance toward their experience, as opposed to embedded or disconnected. They're able to reflect on their experience and grow from it, take different perspectives, take in different perspectives from other people. So Andrew was a young man I interviewed for a research project who fit this. He grew up in a very loving, secure home. His parents were very, very secure, very attuned. And so he learned to trust them and to have these gut level expectations that generally people are going to be trustworthy unless they give you a reason not to be. And he was comfortable with emotional intimacy, and he felt close to God as a result of that. So here's a quote to help you think about your implicit sense of where you are with God, from David Benner. Imagine God thinking about you. What do you assume God feels when you come to mind? What do you assume God feels when you come to mind? So, given these ingrained attachment patterns, how do we promote deep, lasting spiritual and emotional growth? I mentioned Jake earlier, this client. So he was putting the work into therapy for quite a while, but at one point he wasn't seeing any change. And he would come in week after week and say, Dr. Hall, how long is this going to take? Nothing seems to be getting better. And he wanted to quit therapy every week. And so we just kept processing that with him. And I'll come back to the story, but he wanted immediate results, right? And don't we all want that, right? When we put effort into grow or heal, or to, even if it's to, get rid of pain, we want to see immediate results for our efforts. If we put 2 units of effort in, we want 2 units out of growth. And when that doesn't happen, which is a lot of the time, it leaves us feeling helpless and demoralized. And then even if we do see some initial growth, like Jake did, we eventually hit a wall in which these deep patterns surface again, even if they show up in different ways. So why does this happen? Why don't we see the growth and change we expect, and maybe even feel like we deserve? And when this happens, how do we stay motivated to grow and keep moving forward? To address these questions and struggles, the first step is to understand how deep growth works. First, we have to understand the overall goal, which is to change the implicit self. Our implicit relational knowledge of attachment filters, what we expect at a deep gut level about how God feels toward us and how the important people in our life feel about us. Second, we have to see the big picture that growth is not a straight path or a solo journey. It's a winding journey filled with curves, confusing roundabouts, and seeming dead ends. You just have to keep moving, even when the path twists and turns and you're not exactly sure where you're going. You have to keep engaging in spiritual practices and keep doing the internal work and the relational work with the help of mentors and people in your life, even when you don't see results. Third, while difficult to see, small incremental changes are very important and build on each other until they coalesce into something qualitatively new. When this occurs, there is a transformation in the internal landscape of our soul. Our attachment filters reorganize, leading to a new experience of the self and new ways of relating. There may be long periods of time in which small incremental changes build on each other below the surface, and we're not able to clearly see them, and that, again, can be discouraging. At certain points, however, one of those incremental changes will cause our attachment filters to shift or reorganize, leading to deep growth. And this is what we might call a spiritual tipping point, the moment when deep change occurs and becomes visible. A tipping point is when a small input has a large and unpredictable effect. You might recognize that term from Malcolm Gladwell, who popularized it and ripped it off from social scientists. Tipping points are an example of what scientists call nonlinear change or discontinuous change. I mentioned my client Jake earlier. He struggled with a lot of anxiety, fear of abandonment. And I mentioned that, at one point in therapy, he just was despairing, not seeing any change. But he kept at it. He kept coming in. He kept doing the work. He kept going to church, engaging in spiritual practices. And then at a certain point, a tipping point happened. And it wasn't like he was completely healed. I wish I could claim that. Or that all his pain went away. But he was different. Something shifted inside. He began to feel differently about himself at a gut level. He felt more worthy of love. He had different expectations of other people. He felt seen and known by me. He felt closer to God. And because of that, he started to relate differently to others. And because of that, he started to get different responses from others. And so it started to create a new dynamic in all of his relationships. You may have experienced this kind of internal shift in yourself and or witnessed it in others. We move through our daily lives, and then in the midst of maybe an unexpected connection with a friend or maybe even an acquaintance, a time of quiet prayer or communal worship, something clicks and the internal landscape of our soul shifts. It may be a seemingly small input, but it leads to a big change, deep growth that affects our core sense of self. So how then do these transformational shifts in our attachment filters take place, and how do we intentionally promote this kind of growth? While relationships are the vehicle for change, they are somewhat out of our control. We can't control how others engage with us, but there are some things that are in our control. We can do our part to facilitate the internal and relational processes that lead to deep growth. One of the key processes, and of course there's a lot that could be talked about here, but I'm going to focus on a couple things for the sake of time. And one of the key processes in deep change is the integration of two ways of knowing. And we've already seen this referenced in several of the talks. Integration of two ways of knowing, which is facilitated by story. So a key process in deep growth is bringing two ways of knowing together. So I've alluded to these two ways of knowing. Explicit knowledge, or head knowledge, as we know it colloquially, and implicit relational knowledge. We have to bring them together so they work together in harmony. They're both important and they mutually reinforce one another. This is what I call the knowledge spiral. In this integrating back and forth process, we create and discover meaning through a story process. This happens in two ways, although in reality, they're both part of one overall dynamic process of reorganizing or remixing our experiences and knowledge. In one dimension, we interpret our experience through telling our story to ourselves and others. In another dimension, we feel an idea as we hear stories that work our explicit knowledge into our hearts. So interpreting our experience, this involves linking our raw, gut-level knowledge, experience, and feelings to words and ideas. This is central to any growth process. It's central to sanctification, and it's a key process, if not the foundational process in psychotherapy. So I mentioned Jake and that comment I made at one point that eventually, you feel like eventually everyone will leave you. And this captured a deep baseline experience that he had his entire life, but he had never put it into words. And so putting that into words helped him to feel known and seen. It helped him to be able to look at this experience. It became more clear. It allows us to bring those experiences into relationship with God and other people. And he was able to do that on his own in the process of therapy, or put his experience into his own words. At one point he said, I needed my dad's support as a child, but he let me down by making it unsafe to talk about our loss. This interpretive process enabled him to see the overall impact this had on his life and to feel not just anger toward his dad, but also a new sense that it was okay to feel anger. And that was the beginning of a healing journey for him. This is part of how interpreting his previously inchoate experience changed the experience. It was now much more defined, and it led to a new overall experience of himself, that his feelings are okay and that he is worth loving. This ultimately led to a growing forgiveness of his father and a new sense of security with God. The very act of narrating your experiences changes your perception of those experiences, allowing them to provide a loving connection that will bring growth and healing. The second way, the two ways of knowing come together through story, is when we feel an idea or feel God's truth. Through story, an idea or meaning becomes fused with our emotions and implicit knowledge, thus transforming it. So how does story change us? It does so by conveying explicit knowledge in the implicit realm through the very structure embedded within it. So this is Robert McKee, a screenwriter who wrote an excellent book called, you guessed it, Story, the creative title. Here's what he says: the exchange between artist and audience expresses idea directly through the senses and perceptions, intuition, and emotion. Story doesn't explain its view of life, its explicit knowledge in abstract ideas. Instead, it creates what McKee calls aesthetic emotion, the feeling of an idea. This is a more structured form of implicit knowledge, a knowing that exists in our emotions and experience, but carries within it an idea. Aesthetic emotion is a very important concept because it exists at the borderline between implicit and explicit knowledge, coming very close to a fusion between the two. As one example, in the movie The Martian Child, which is a wonderful movie, John Cusack stars in it, it's based on a true story. Science fiction writer and widower David Gordon adopts an orphan boy named Dennis, who thinks he's from Mars. Throughout the film, the human experience of the story is dramatized, and we feel a profound idea about our own relationships. Loss profoundly hinders our ability to love. After a series of relational breakthroughs and setbacks between David and Dennis, a lot of ups and downs, Dennis, the boy, finally runs away and climbs a tower to wait for his Martian people to come save him. David finds him, climbs the tower 200 feet in the air, and reaches out to Dennis with an emotional plea. Dennis, he says, you're my son. You belong to me, and I will never, ever, ever, ever leave you. And at this moment, Dennis has a choice to make. He can continue to hope that his Martian people will come and take him home, or he can give up his defenses and take the risk of trusting David. And as we see Dennis run into David's arms, we immediately feel the controlling idea. Love overcomes loss when we face our fears and reach out to one another. This would be horrible if I was showing the clip. The same principles apply to stories in Scripture and stories we might hear in our spiritual communities. Jesus taught truths through story to help us feel and experience them. The parable of the prodigal son is a well-known example. In this parable, we read about the son who squanders his inheritance and yet returns home and humbly seeks his father's forgiveness. Father, he says, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. When we read that the Father who represents God was filled with love and compassion when he saw his son a long way off, and that he threw a party to celebrate because his son was dead and now he has returned, we feel the idea. God is infinitely gracious and delights when we seek to reconcile with him. Jesus' parables are designed to help us feel God's truth so that we know and inhabit them in a deeper way than just intellectually. Stories, then, help us to feel God's truth, to feel ideas so they sink down into our hearts and transform the implicit self. I want to close where I started. We are loved into loving. To find meaning and grow spiritually, you must open yourself to be loved into loving. There is no other way. Being loved into loving by God and others, ultimately in the context of the church, is the only antidote to the social and spiritual disconnection that we are now experiencing at a societal level and in our individual lives. I want to close with this prayer Paul prayed for the Ephesians in chapter 3, verses 17 to 19, and this is my prayer for you. May your roots go down deep into the soil of God's marvelous love, and may you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep his love really is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it is so great you will never fully understand it. Thank you.